judgments or feedback or a stated comment, and the response in the person with rejection sensitivity is it's reactive, and it can be quite explosive. The person might not necessarily act in an explosive manner, but that's the experience. But because it's not actually officially listed as a thing, we know it's real because clients talk about it.
The acknowledgement of the awful pain of RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria. Part of the therapy work is also helping somebody eventually move beyond having such rejection pain in their life, because it's so hard to deal with, and can lead so much to things like meltdown. So, do you want to talk about what's on the agenda for today?
Well, actually, talking about rejection sensitivity, I didn't realize that I was going to go down such a rabbit hole when I started to look at it. Have you done the same?
A bit, yes. Yeah. I can
because clients do talk about it and experience horrible experiences around it. But because it's not actually officially listed as a thing, in the like diagnostic manuals or in the clinical literature, let's say, we know it's real because clients talk about it. But then, of course, I'm like comparing it to this, comparing it to that, comparing it to this. Is that what you did?
That's what I've been doing as well. Yeah. Like, what does it link with? It's not some entirely isolated, entirely new thing. It's new terminology and it's useful terminology, but it's not something entirely unconnected with things we already have been thinking about. Yeah. So what did you kind of...
I mean, I was thinking about it in comparison to a few things, but the two things that I really think are significant are rejection sensitivity dysphoria, as is usually related to ADHD-ers. Usually they are, not always, of course, but often my ADHD clients are people who will talk about it. And the other thing is self-rejection. And I think I hadn't realized until now that I thought that they were the same thing. And I'm not saying that a person can't have both of those things going on, but they do seem to be that I found quite a few distinctions, actually, which I thought was really interesting.
Yeah. Well, I suppose, problem of self-rejection is partly the problem of how it feels, but it's also just partly the problem of how much self-rejection is going on. Whereas the problem of rejection sensitivity, as I understand it, can, of course, be to do with the amount of rejection you're receiving, but a lot of it is simply to do with the amount of sensitivity you have to that rejection. In other words, you might not be receiving more rejection than some other people around you, but they don't experience it as sensitively or with such pain. It's like RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, or rejection sensitive dysphoria. The dysphoria part, I mean, it's one of those technical terms like alexithymia and things like that, that capture something important, but that can sound a little bit abstract. I think pain is the word that would simply occur to me. That's what people say. They just say pain of rejection is just so utterly unbearable compared to how it seems to be for a lot of people.
Yeah. And one of the important distinctions I'm noticed, it works for me anyway to describe it like this, is that the rejection sensitivity dysphoria tends to be situation specific. So it's triggered off by an incident of feedback or evaluation or something that happens relationally. It tends to happen in relationships, actually, or interactions. And it's often about doing, the things that the person is or isn't doing, judgments or feedback or a stated comment and the response in the person with rejection sensitivity is largely physiological. There's a great big set of physiology that reacts. It's reactive, and
a kind of a cascade. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it can be quite explosive. The
Yeah.
person might not necessarily act in an explosive manner, but that's the experience, isn't it?
Yeah.
Whereas when we're talking about the self-rejection, it seems to me as if that's more about being. It's more about having a potentially at the background, a continuous background that may or may not get experienced or may not feel relevant at any one time, but that can become more foreground and background, foreground and background, or it might be constant all the time, like a shame-based identity, so it's more about um, you know, not necessarily that something that you've just done has triggered it off, but there's some sense of worthlessness at the back of the conclusions that the person is making is about their own worthlessness or shame about that they are not something,
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, this is where, for me, it feels like RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria, as a new concept and as a very useful concept, also really links into things that I've already been familiar with for quite a while, and we all have. So it's not like I feel like, it's just the same thing. No, it's a very important way of capturing a specific aspect in a specific way that really works for people, and that's vitally important, and the language of it. And yet, I personally, it reminds me of a lot of work I've done over the years with people where what we're naming is low self-worth, low self-esteem, shame, high levels of self-criticism, high levels of self-judgment, which in turn makes them very vulnerable to judgment by others, criticism by others, rejection by others, so that the two are linked, as I think is partly what you're feeling, is that if you're very self-rejecting and very self-doubting and very low sense of self-worth, and tend to kind of judge yourself and reject yourself, then you're in very much a vulnerable position to be triggered by someone else's rejection. Somebody who's pretty solid in themselves, someone else's rejection just won't have quite the same impact. It might be unpleasant or unwanted, but it won't have that same cascade effect where everything just kind of falls apart and there's just immense pain, as you say, psychologically and physiologically, compared to, I think, somebody who's in already in that state of a very, kind of self-rejecting relationship, low self-esteem or whatever you want to call that, which also then, and also, even when we use the term judgment, it reminds me of kind of what people with social phobia, social anxiety would describe, that sense of I feel so judged, and I'm not even sure sometimes which bits of it I'm imagining, which bits of it are real, but I just feel it's everywhere, So I'm not saying it's all exactly the same thing. It's all slightly different. It's the same territory, I think, it's the same territory. So I don't think it's entirely new territory. It's just this is the useful piece of it that we're capturing. Yeah.
Yes, I was thinking about social anxiety as well. I was thinking about social anxiety being anticipatory as well.
Yes.
Where somebody is anticipating going into the social situations, whereas with rejection sensitivity, a person may obviously build up a knowledge of the pattern and anticipate, but generally speaking, it's reactive. The evaluation or the comment has happened, and before you know it, the person feels like they're on fire, and it can be I wonder whether there's something about the person themselves actually being in conflict about their own sense of worth, that part of them might be sensitive to it because potentially they've been exposed to that belief before, but now they feel angry about being considered to be negatively evaluated. So it's like they're trying to push back in a way. The body is like going, no, this is not okay.
Well, a fight or flight response in a way.
Yeah. Whereas the person with the self-rejection, the shame-based identity, there could be like withdrawal. It accumulates, doesn't it? That kind of thing accumulates, and that a person may end up withdrawing. It can look very much like depression. A person could obviously be depressed at the same time, but it could be less explosive and more feeling about, I'm just wrong, or a lot of different physiology. So that like over a longer spread, like headaches or tension in the body or gastric kind of issues. It's like a landscape of, rather than a quick explosion, an acute thing of. Is that your experience as well?
Yeah, I think so. And I think like that, as you say, that, the focus then is on a bigger picture of anticipatory, anxiety and possibly, imaginings, because obviously if you're anticipating, you don't know whether things will turn out, what you're imagining will turn out to be true or not. So, classic anxiety stuff. But, also, carrying a lot of, what we would see as developmental issues, because that's another thing I'm wondering about in this area. When people talk about rejection sensitivity and specifically as a thing as RSD, to what extent are we thinking or saying or wondering whether this is part of the package of a neurotype that we're born with. And I'm hearing lots about it in the world of autistic people as well as people with ADHD and people with both. So we'll see how this all settles. But are we wondering whether this kind of sensitivity, like sensory sensitivity, just goes with neurotype? Are we more thinking that so far, like we say, do we really know any non-traumatized neurodivergent adults? Well then maybe we're saying this is part of the developmental experiences that most neurodivergent people have had so far, and therefore they're highly rejection sensitive, but might not be so if their developmental experiences have been more supportive and more accurately mirroring who they are, and so on and so forth. Like, again, I think there's a long way to go yet with all of these themes. What they mean, where they come from, what we call them, how they link with other things that we talk about and already work with. Like, that's the bit that I'm in one way interested in, because I've worked a lot with social anxiety and low self-esteem, for instance. They're two big areas for me. And it was working a lot with social anxiety that led me to actually identify the possibility of exploring with some clients that they might be autistic, and it turned out they identified as autistic. So there's a big link there for me. And then once I found myself working with some adult autistic, late discovery autistic adults, I found my experience around low self-esteem work was very useful, because this is what people tend to carry so far. And so then when I come across the description of rejection sensitivity dysphoria, I think that's a very useful way of naming something. But I also feel like, but how does it fit into kind of what I already know, what I'm already doing? And we have to be careful about that, because you can take something and just co-opt it entirely into what you're doing as a therapist and say, it's just that by another name. Or you can say, here's something very brand new, entirely new idea, which I would be a little bit dubious about, because I don't think anything's quite that literally brand new and separate. Or you find some way to helpfully, usefully link it in what you already know. So going back to what we said at the start, that was mainly what came up for me when we said we'd talk about this. Was this is really powerful, interesting, useful, therapeutic idea, very useful thing to talk about with some of our clients. Absolutely essential, and yet also, how do we link it in with our current theory and skills?
Because I'm thinking about clients that come in specifically with rejection sensitivity at the forefront, and they're actually entering into therapy with that front of mind kind of thing, and they'll say that in my experience, that they will often actually promote that idea that they are too much, they're too intense, they're too sensitive, that they always find it difficult to trust people because they're expecting or they're assuming a negative evaluation, and that others have told them that as well. And they're sort of saying, and I just can't help it, because I rush off to the loo and I'm in floods of tears, and I know technically it's an overreaction, but it is a reaction. It's a real reaction that my whole system has. And then, and there's the ones I'm thinking of, they're saying, what can I do about this? Because I feel uncomfortable about it. I feel like I'd like to be able to have a more measured response to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Whereas people who have more of a self-rejection kind of thing, they're not coming in saying, I'm too much, or I'm too intense, or I'm too sensitive. It doesn't.
I find they often are.
Oh.
A lot of the people that I've worked with who have low self-esteem, or that's what we identify, and often then social anxiety on top of that. Now, it may nowadays they happen to be, neurodivergent as well, because that's my client base, and who knows how many were in the past. I don't know. But I often find that's one big part of the problem. In other words, because in fact, the bit they're less aware of when they come to me is how self-rejecting they are. And that's what I'm digging up for them, But what they're bringing often is this terribly high sensitivity to rejection and judgment, negative judgment, and finding it just unbearable. But then often how that shows is in the compensatory strategies rather than in the feeling, because they've managed to find, various ways of masking and compensating that mean they just, as much as possible, avoid rejection, and I think this is something a lot of, again, people with ADHD who talk about rejection sensitivity, I think would identify this as well. It's like people pleasing is one of the top ones. It's just, if you just absolutely just do your very best never to be rejected, because no one ever has a reason to reject you, then in a way you're coming to therapy with being stuck in relationships you don't want to be in, and exhausted and distant from yourself and all. That's what's on top. That's the presenting issue. Underneath that, you find both, terror of rejection and loads of self-rejection, because I think it's partly can be conceptualized as a set of core beliefs. In other words, I'm unworthy of acceptance. If I see myself as unworthy of acceptance, then naturally I reject myself, but also, of course, people are going to reject me, and that's a terrifying prospect. And then whenever it seems to be happening, or actually is happening, it's kind of unbearable. But I'm not saying that this explains all of what we call RSD. That's what I'm trying to figure out. How does it tie in with concepts we already have, like anxious attachment, or deep fear of abandonment? Do you know what I mean? Where's the line between abandonment and rejection? Abandonment maybe is multiple long-term rejection or something like that, not just this occasion of rejection, but this sense that this person is rejecting me so much they're abandoning me, or they're going to abandon me. But I just think that in both in theory but also in the real world work with a client or with ourselves, these things always end up a bit more complex, don't they? The more you...
Yeah, because people aren't the theories, are they? They're not just going to be in one column of thing, that's the thing. I know, yeah. And I've heard clients say, not that people are telling me I'm too much, but I'm not enough, actually. That's the thing, isn't it? With the self-rejecting or the low self-esteem, the sense of worthlessness rather than unworthiness, which is slightly different, I think. Maybe I'm splitting hairs there, but
it's just depends on how it shows in a particular person. I'm not good enough because I'm too much. That is certainly a theme for some autistic people, I think, and probably ADHD as well, now that I think of it. But it's like, this is not how you're supposed to be.
It can cause people to flit along on the surface, can't it, as well? Because if I'm too much, and I can't trust because I'm going to get negatively evaluated, then I won't stay too long. I won't get too deep with you. Because first of all, I won't hear it from you.
That's the thing,
which is going to be painful.
Yeah. So that brings me back to sort of compensatory strategies, because so sort of people pleasing, kind of distancing and avoidance. One that occurs to me, and I've come across, been discussing it with a few clients recently, so it reminded me of the fact that it was actually something that I remember doing myself in my 20s, which is kind of cynicism and arrogance and superiority. So it's like,
Mm.
well, people don't matter anyway, to be honest. So it doesn't matter if they reject me, because they're not worth my while, kind of sour grapes type of attitude, So there's all sorts of things that, if you were to draw it, would link in with the circle on the page that says RSD. It's not that that's not important. It's very important, but way of describing a particular experience and a particular aspect of how some people find themselves in their life. But I think yes, it does link with quite a few other approaches and thoughts and attitudes we already have. I mean, if for instance, if we just take the word rejection and forget about the S and the D and the word rejection, like I found myself thinking about that a good bit recently because I was thinking about the whole area of loneliness and neurodivergent people, which is something for us to maybe come back to, because like in the end of it all, the experience of real full-blown loneliness is one of the most awful experiences, and of course very not only horrible to feel, but terribly dangerous in terms of both your mental and your physical health. But loneliness, in a way, is what it means to feel lonely. It is, in a sense, to feel rejected in some way, because you don't feel lonely based on whether there's people around or not.
No,
you feel lonely based on whether you feel those people accept you or reject you. You might not conceptualize it that way when you're feeling it, but that's what it boils down to. It's like, am I welcome and connected and wanted and understood, or am I unaccepted and nobody cares and they don't understand me and they don't even care to understand me and I'm rejected, And so, it's a big connection, I think, between those immediate instances that you were focusing on, and that is more what RSD focuses on, and that's very helpful because those are real experiences of immediate pain, immediate in the moment, in context, rejection by a particular person in a particular way, and the awful pain that goes with that, the unbearable pain. There's links between that, I think, and this broader category of the awful kind of isolation and loneliness that people can end up feeling, which links with stuff we've talked about and talk about on our course as well, around the whole societal dimension of all of this, as well as the individual. At some level we feel, as neurodivergent people growing up, we feel rejected by society, not just by individuals. So I just think it's just a huge topic, really, I suppose, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, because I mean, a person who is experiencing that, any human being would eventually begin to feel uncomfortable or shame about having relational needs.
That's right.
And then that shame may be felt, or it may be defended against, as you say, by aloofness, or by convincing yourself or rationalizing that you don't need it, or that you won't. So that prevents you to even from getting in that situation where you might have a place of being vulnerable in relation to others, and then accepting care, being acceptable if you're not performing, or if you're not perfect, or if you're not overcoming this, to compensate for not being enough or being wrong. But to be more vulnerable about that, it puts you in a position where you can't be open to accepting care and support, or insights about ways in which you're not perfect, because nobody actually is. So that's a really isolating experience, isn't it? So that they see a partial me, the bit that I'm prepared to risk being related, in relationship.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's a key point, and I think the piece about the shame of being lonely. Like there's something wrong with you if you're lonely. I think that'd be a theme that would be maybe worth our while coming back to. Even the shame of long-term loneliness for neurodivergent people, but that brings us into that larger territory, and I suppose I'm thinking it might also be a good idea to come back to the immediate experience of rejection sensitivity dysphoria that we started with, because that experience, when it happens for people, and as it's being described these days by people in their lived experience of being ADHD or autistic or both or whatever, is reminds me also another thing it links with in my mind is meltdown, because it seems again that's sometimes what it triggers for
Yeah.
neurodivergent people.
Yeah.
It's so unbearable, and it's so, such a fight or
Mm,
flight response. It's so painful at a physical and emotional level, and so sort of intolerable and impossible, that I think, yeah,
mm,
for a lot of people, then it links directly with meltdown and shutdown. Yeah.
mhm. Yeah. Yeah, that absolutely intolerable feeling. It's like it's totally intolerable to be able to stay engaged or to stay regulated in the face of negative evaluation, or even if it's perceived. But often it isn't just perceived, is it? It's not made up. It's there's
Oh no,
this,
oh no, oh no. You see, this again brings us back to that bigger picture of we actually have
Mm,
experienced lots of rejection in our lives,
mm, mhm.
and what if that was different, like in the future? What would that be like? We don't know, but in actual reality, lots of neurodivergent people have experienced a lot of rejection, more than the average, more neurotypical kind of person, because that's partly what it means to be, atypical. Is human beings seem to be more likely to reject anyone who comes across as atypical, So it's a lot of it is real, certainly in people's experience in general, but certainly in lots of real situations as well. Yeah. So then the sort of managing to somehow deal with that simply in the moment and in the situation, and
Mm.
come out the other side of it, is a big piece of what we're also just trying to learn how to help people with, at the moment, isn't it?
Mm. Yeah, because if you think about where it often happens, if you like to be socially, to get feedback socially or in the workplace or in the educational system, of course, these are all in the neuronormative framework. So it might be that potentially there could be um, some part of the feedback that is useful, but it might not be, or it might be that it's being presented as the negative aspect of the feedback is that because you're not doing it right in the neuronormative way or something like that,
Mm.
and then to then expect clients to be able to take that on board and engage with it and be reasonable about it is not the right thing.
No, but like I totally agree, because I think the kind of examples that would come to mind for me, and you can imagine these, kind of examples all the way from childhood right through adulthood, which is the kind of examples where somebody thinks of something or does something or brings something. So a child does a drawing and brings it to their mother or to
Mm-hmm.
friends,
Mm-hmm.
somebody at work decides to, kind of, put up some nice decorations for Christmas to surprise everybody. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Whatever. They have a thought, they
Yeah.
think this is a nice thing to do, they do
Mm-hmm.
it. And then people go, "What the hell are you doing? Do you know? Ah, that's silly." Or, "Oh God, no, that's we don't want that." Do you know what I mean? And the devastation. I think that's one example of the kind of rejection that we're often talking about here. Is you come with enthusiasm and you're slapped down.
Yeah.
I think that's
Mm-hmm.
one big example that I
Mm-hmm.
sort of come across. But another one that's quite different from that, and is a bit more of an adult one, or adolescent and adult one, maybe more so, that it can definitely occur in childhood, is just being left out. You find out on Monday that everybody else went out for a drink on Friday and just nobody asked you.
Mm-hmm.
Again, there's the pain of that, like just can just go through you like a dagger. Now that's a kind of experience again a lot of people can relate to. If it happens, not feeling pain, but from what we're hearing, the kind of level of overwhelming pain that then happens for some people when they've those
Mm-hmm.
issues is just what we're calling that kind of
I'm remembering
dysphoria.
some kind of examples as well,
Yeah.
actually, thinking
Mm.
about people I've known over a long, 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 long time, and things such as, you know, they could be marvelous at their job, a person with integrity, loyalty, honesty, and all the rest of it, hardworking, interested, and responsible, keeping up their side of the bargain as an employee. And then feedback might be, oh, you're not a team player.
Oh, yes.
Or your tone of voice, you need to learn to modify that. It's too brusque. It's like, why pick on that when everything else about the person is excellent? You know,
I
they're
know.
excelling actually. Why are you not seeing the value in that? And then no wonder that body has a response to that. You know, the tone of voice or tone policing, it's called, isn't
Yeah,
it?
that's right. That's
But that's
right.
not fun when it's one thing when it's you're being tone policed on Facebook or something, or but it's another thing entirely when you're in your annual review and
Yeah,
that's part of your official feedback,
yeah,
and the
yeah,
person is trying to hold back their tears or frustration,
yeah,
you
yeah.
know,
And you're basically being told, you know, you're not really in. You're nearly in, but you're not
something
actually
about you're not
in.
right. Yeah, and
Yeah,
it's not acceptable.
you're not quite part of the club. You're
Yeah.
just a kind of a associate member,
Mm,
is what you're being told.
mm.
It reminds me of some of the kind of evolutionary psychology around all of this as well, around neurodivergence, but also around just loneliness and rejection and so on. What they say is that, the potential depth of response of pain towards feeling, kind of rejected by the group you need to and want to and belong to and feel you are part of, and then feel you're not, or, obviously with individuals that are important to you as well. But that, the depth of that reaction can be partly attributable to the fact that when we were, evolving as hunter-gatherers, that kind of rejection would have led to death, if you weren't
Yeah.
accepted, if you were rejected and
Mm,
isolated and expelled and not
that's
wanted by
right. Yeah.
by your tribe, that you were dead. You wouldn't be able to live on your own. So
No.
it is worth remembering that when we think about this topic.
Oh, I did. Yeah, I sometimes say that. I remind clients of
Mm.
that sometimes when they're trying to diminish it as, oh, I'm just imagining it
Yeah,
all.
yeah,
Well,
yeah,
this is actually how mammals behave, and
yeah. That's
mammals
right.
still do that if you
That's right.
watch nature
Yeah, social
programs.
mammals. Yeah, social mammals.
Yeah, uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yeah, so the microaggression is there, even though the person might not consciously be
yeah,
thinking, right, we're going to cast this person out so that
yeah,
they die alone. They
yeah.
might not literally be thinking that,
No.
but it's got that
Mm,
quality to it, hasn't it? It's got
yeah,
that level of intent, some level of intent is there in
yeah,
that. So that's what gets picked up on, that's what gets responded to.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
frightening to think, isn't it?
yeah. It is. It is frightening, and therefore a huge issue. So, I mean, then coming back to, yeah, like how we're trying to, deal with all of this for ourselves, but also helping clients. I suppose those bits of psychoeducation are useful for a start, putting the whole thing in a bit of context, and taking maybe some of the shame out of the response and increasing the self-compassion. But it's still a very tough, painful issue, and
Mm,
obviously very individual, because it is a general term we're using to describe a common experience for ADHD and I think other
mm.
version people. But obviously everybody has their own history around it.
I suppose
Individual
key has got
story.
to be like evaluating yourself, hasn't it? And how can you do that realistically, unless you do lots of self-exploration,
Mm.
And then once you begin to believe in your own evaluation of self, that at least gives equal energy to something. So if you know that you've got integrity, if you know that you're not intending to be rude or that wasn't your primary motivation in the communication, if you know that might help you to be able to stay your ground in the face of someone saying that to you, and
Yeah.
perhaps be able to then engage with that person about that.
Yeah, and I think ultimately that's really important. Ideally, we acquire more of that solidity within ourselves and our relationship with ourselves. But I also think that's extremely hard to do without also some acceptance in your life. So
Oh
so
yeah,
so that
definitely.
to balance the
Mm,
rejection that
mm,
we're getting and feeling We need to be more self-accepting, but we also, and this is again a very practical issue, I think, for me, therapy work, trying to help clients to find their tribe, find the acceptance, find the place, find the safe place, find the people, even if it's only one person, even if it's only the therapist, where they, you know, feel, you know, pretty much accepted and not rejected, and you know, unconditional positive regard, to use the Rogerian term, you know, but where they feel, there's at least one person, maybe a few people in my life who, I'm not fearful, you know, of that, and I don't need to be, because they accept me, you know. So I mean, that's a huge part of our work anyway at the moment in this whole area, isn't it? Trying to help adult neurodivergent people to just
take ownership of themselves, to have a realistic and regular self-acceptance, and to then to be able to embody that, and to be able to you know, negotiate from that position, you know, with authenticity and, you know, self-agency. It's sort of, you know, one of the things that I read actually about the person who is like the self-rejecter, if you like, the person when the rejection of self. Interestingly, it was fascinating. I started to read about how it's common. What happens is that there's a disconnection from the body, you know, so that it goes along with that. I'm not saying that everybody who's got a disconnection from the body is because it's due to self-rejection, but that self-rejection will eventually lead to disconnection from the body, and it can. You know, if you think about it, maybe in the beginning it's a useful thing so that you don't feel the pain, because that might be a survival strategy, but then it affects interoception and your sensations, but then it goes more than that. So it's like then you're not noticing when you're tired, or then you're not noticing when you're burned out, or you're not aware of the distress because you've got to keep on living, and you're more and more away from acceptance of complete self. Actually, there's a part of yourself that you're not connected with, you know. So it's like getting that connection back in all kinds of different ways, isn't it? Connection with self, connection with your own body, connection with your own life energy, connection with, it's like, safe places, safe people, but by trying to build your way back in a way.
Definitely, yeah. Sometimes, you know, just put under the heading of unmasking, but that's much too small a term for that whole process, you know.
Well, it's part of it. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
it's a starting point, but that's what we're talking about when we say that. We mean, you know, authenticity and finding more of your true self, and identifying your real needs, and, you know, trying to live a life that's more geared towards being likely to meet those real needs. All of that, which is the large overall sort of framework of all the stuff we're talking about here, really, isn't it? In a way, yeah.
Because I mean, the medical model has always pathologized intense emotional things. You know, intense emotional stuff has always been put down to personality issues or mood disorder.
Yeah, particularly in women.
Yeah. You know, and what we're saying is that it's a human thing, and that actually, you know, it's about coming back to being able to be regulated, being able to be your complete self.
Yeah, including, you know, whatever the strong emotions might be, and, you know, I mean, I suppose that's an interesting point, maybe even to finish on, is just on the acknowledgement of the awful pain of RSD, rejection sensitivity dysphoria. But I suppose then that does mean that part of the therapy work is also helping somebody eventually move beyond having such rejection pain in their life, because it's so hard to deal with, and you know, can lead so much to things like meltdown. But also it does partly start with staying with it a bit. That's, as all therapy does, you know. You don't move into a better relationship with really painful emotions by just trying to move past them, you know. So I suppose making space for and acknowledging the pain is absolutely crucial starting point for all of this. Just
and finding ways to tolerate that eventually. Mm.
Yeah, so it is. It's part of the learning curve, though, isn't it? There's all these aspects and areas and concepts and frameworks now that are
Mm-hmm.
emerging in this whole area. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, loads. Yeah,
We'll never run out of things to be learning about.
or
That's the way
things
it
to
should
talk
be.
about.
Yeah,
Yeah,
indeed, indeed. Yeah.
yeah. But I think in summary, for me, what I've taken out of this talk today is there's a lot about disconnection and connection,
Mm,
disengagement and engagement, tolerating and not being able to tolerate, intolerable,
mm.
and
Safety and threat. Yeah,
safety and threat, yeah, and supportive places and people and self-support eventually.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
great. All right. Well,
Yeah,
we'll end for
yeah,
today then and
yeah. Right, right.
come back next week.
Yeah.